This is Boom and Bust in Modern America, Objective 1, about the Roaring Twenties economic boom. And over the course of this lesson, we're going to take a look at the three greatest decades economically in 20th century American history: the 1920s, the 1950s, and the 1990s, all of which have similar causes. For example, the 20s and the 50s, part of the cause is that they follow a war. And in this case, we have the causes of the post-World War I economic boom, beginning with the tax reduction policies of this guy on the left right here, Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon. After a brief recession in 1920 and 21, the economy takes off in one of the three greatest economic booms, like we said, in U.S. history. Tax reductions meant more money for spending and investment. Some people called him the greatest Treasury Secretary ever. The automobile also had a lot to do with that, as Ford created his assembly line in 1913, as you know. Cars are now being mass-produced and less expensive. The common man can now afford it. The River Rouge assembly line is producing a car every 10 seconds, and by 1930, Ford had produced 20 million Model T cars. One was the sale of electronic durable goods, and if you don't know what a durable good is, it's a good that lasts for a long time. Perishable goods would be things like, Kleenex or food or things like that. Generators become big business during this time as well. But the primary durable good that affected everything was the radio. The first broadcast of the radio was at station KDKA in Pittsburgh, and here's a date that I want you to be aware of, in 1920. That should be bold-faced on your lesson. It was the TV of its time, with the same cultural impact. Obviously, you couldn't see it, but think about how TV unites people today in terms of a gathering place and entertainment, sports, politics, things like that. The radio had that cultural impact in the 1920s. There were other electronic durable goods as well that made an impact also. Household appliances were becoming more prominent because people could afford them. And advertising those household appliances to women across the country became big business as well. Basically, all the household appliances that we have today, all but the TV and the microwave, were coming back into prominence as being mass-produced items in the Roaring Twenties. Here's a 1920s washer and dryer, and you can already see what's going to happen here is that in the 50s, we're going to see all these appliances being sold again, just upgraded. But here's a washer and dryer from the 1920s. A refrigerator. Stoves became popular again in the 1920s. Toasters. And vacuums. All of these things were mass-produced and more affordable at this time in history. The light bulb was also mass-produced and affordable for everyone, and the ripple effect on the industrial spending cycle was huge, just like it had been before. Think about all the different materials that are involved in producing automobiles and electronic durable goods. Transportation and commerce, again, now that vehicles are more affordable, and how that affects food and farming. Road construction became a big part of the American economy, as all the materials needed to build roads added to the spending cycle. Roads like Route 66, the famous historic highway that runs from Chicago, Illinois to Santa Monica, California. Gas stations along the roads and for homes and businesses, construction of those things. And if you look at all of those things alone that are going to be impacted by the automobile and the electronic durable goods, also think about the oil for industrial machines and the automobiles themselves, steel for the automobiles, durable goods, buildings, bridges, rubber for the automobiles, fabric and leather for the automobiles, construction and clothing, glass for the automobiles, for buildings, for light bulbs, for consumer goods, concrete for roads and buildings, lumber for buildings and railroads, and paint for, well, everything. But it wasn't just in America where it was affecting the spending cycle. Whether you were producing those things and buying the raw materials or buying those things as a consumer, demand for those products was going up. Supply, therefore, had to go up. Jobs had to go up. Money was being put in people's pockets so they could buy even more stuff. And over in Europe, they needed a lot of rebuilding after World War I, and they bought most of what they needed from the United States. And also, Europe also wanted the newly mass-produced consumer goods that were being created in the United States. So basically, demand for everything was high in the U.S. already during the Roaring Twenties, and the European market just doubled that demand. But not only was Europe buying more stuff, the consumer culture of the Roaring Twenties back here had a huge ripple effect on the microeconomic spending cycle as well. Between the US and Europe, demand for everything, both personal consumer goods and the resources needed to produce those personal consumer goods, goes way up, which means supply for everything must meet that demand. Increased supply means more jobs, easy for anyone to get a job. Increased employment leads to a spending boom for everything, and the spending cycle continues with continued demand, as people just get their money and spend it on more and more things. Installment plans and buying on credit became big in the Roaring Twenties. Possess today and pay tomorrow. Houses, cars, electronic durable goods. The middle class had never really existed before in the 1800s. You were either rich or poor. But now, with the ability to buy things that the rich had and pay for them later, the middle class had arrived really for the first time in American history. This led to massive amounts of debt. In the 1920s, 75%, 3 out of every 4 goods in America, were bought on credit. Advertising on Madison Avenue was a huge part of this. Madison Avenue was in New York City, and it became well known around the country as the advertising capital of the world, with all these new consumer goods. And the mantra was, whatever it takes. It was the science of marketing, which was the manipulation of consumers in order to make them think that they could be happier with their lives than they currently are, and getting them to buy more and more and more products to make that happen. It was the use of persuasion, sometimes through seduction, sometimes through humor, sometimes through sexual innuendo or sentimentality, whatever it took to sell the product. Madison Avenue in New York City becomes the center of the fastest growing business in America, marketing, also known as advertising, and it was headed by this guy, Bruce Barton, the founding father of the American advertising industry. Barton wrote a book called The Man Nobody Knows, claiming that Jesus Christ was the greatest ad man ever, saying that the parables were marvelously condensed and brilliant in their message, and also that he picked up 12 men from the bottom ranks of business and forged them into an organization that conquered the world. It was a bestseller. The radio also comes to prominence as a selling machine in the 1920s. Once you get everybody gathered around it, you can sell almost anything. In Europe, radio was owned by the government and only public broadcasting was allowed. In America, privately owned radio stations made the radio a new selling machine. Soap operas were among those things that became the most popular. Husbands were away during the day, the wives were home by themselves with a radio, and so soap companies started paying for stories of drama and romance that would hook the listener in, and on the commercial breaks, convince them to buy soap. And the soap opera becomes a popular part of American culture. Also, streets in New York City became symbols of the new affluence of America, like Park Avenue and Fifth Avenue, which was famous as a home of the rich. If you had a Park Avenue lifestyle, you wanted to be like them. Wall Street, as it always had been, was a symbol of economic prosperity, and again, Wall Street is in New York. And Broadway, also known as the Great White Way, which was the capital of the entertainment industry in America, at least until Hollywood became prominent in the late 20s. But inevitably, the bull market was going to come crashing down. The sky was not the limit. Now again, the difference between a bull market and a bear market was that a bull market is when the economy or the stock market is doing really well. A bear market is when it's not. In this case, you recognize J.P. Morgan there? The bull market was impacted by a couple of things. The return of the Wildcat Bank, which, if you remember from prior lessons, is just a bank that's giving out too many reckless loans. And once again, land speculation or gambling on land purchases, hoping it's going to pay off, just like the old days, came back to prominence. In Florida, they were selling underwater plots of land, just hoping people would buy it and it would turn into something. It was ridiculous. Stock market speculation and buying on margin became big. A lot of gambling on risky stocks is what stock market speculation was. Sometimes borrowing from the bank to do it and not being able to pay the bank back. Other times putting a down payment on the stock. This is buying on margin, with the promise to pay the rest after making a profit on it. The problem, of course, is what if the stock doesn't pan out? Meanwhile, the government was doing very little to regulate economic practices. 3 straight presidents, Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, who you see in the cartoon here, and Herbert Hoover believed greatly in laissez-faire economics, or to leave alone, to let the economy do what it was going to do. All 3 were Republicans, and this is a traditionally Republican policy, so it made sense. The economy was booming, so keep your hands off of it. As a result, there are no government policies in place to regulate the stock market or support anyone if they're down. If the bottom dropped out, you're basically down, out, and on your own. But why do that when the economy is going so well? Also, people wonder about Mellon's tax reductions. It freed up more money for spending in an investment. In hindsight, should taxes have been kept higher to avoid reckless spending and investment? Some people are going to say yes. Some people are going to say no. In any event, the economy was going to crash soon. The number one reason, and this is extremely important, is that we had a surplus of automobiles, electronic durable goods, and, we haven't talked about this yet, a surplus of agriculture. Farms had mechanized in the 1800s into the 1890s and had produced a ton for the war. Well, now we had a surplus of grain. So when you have the surplus of automobiles, electronic durable goods, and agricultural products, you just have way too much, and you don't need to supply as much, don't need as many workers, and therefore they're going to lose jobs and the ability to spend. Our ability to produce had surpassed our ability to consume. Also, installment plans had bad effects on the spending cycle. Too many in the middle class were now overextending themselves, continually buying with the idea that prosperity would never end. Many found themselves with insurmountable debt, but their buying had driven up the demand and therefore the supply. They couldn't buy anymore, and the surplus was now sitting in factories. The decline in the European market had something to do with it as well. They had what they needed and were wobbly economically. They couldn't always afford what they wanted. And as a result, the market crashed. Now remember, according to the law of supply, if people want your product, you're going to put as much of it out there as you can and drive the price up for it. That's no different with stocks. At the time, people believed that everybody wanted to buy stock, so a reckless price boom started to happen. Everybody raised their prices too fast, and then a panic of selling started because people were starting to wonder if people would buy the overpriced stock, and so they all decided to drop their prices at the same time. Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, was when the bottom completely dropped out and the market crashed. People were wiped out. People were going to local bridges and jumping off. Suicides started happening immediately. There were massive bank failures. With people wiped out, they couldn't repay their loans. Many banks had loaned recklessly and given away all of their reserves, hoping to make huge profits at record interest rates. Credit cards, for example, were up to 25% interest during this particular time. But when those loans weren't paid back, thousands of Americans, whether they had taken out reckless loans or not, lost everything. They started to gather at banks and wonder what was going on inside. Was their money still even there? And often they found out it was not. Bank runs, as people ran to the bank to get their money out before the banks could loan it out recklessly, became very common in the 1920s after the stock market crash. The great crash of the stock market almost overnight ruined people economically. The eventual unemployment rate would jump to 25%, 3 times of what it would be in a bad economy today. And psychologically, as people who were used to taking care of themselves really couldn't do so anymore. That's it. Thanks again for listening.